Morning, guys. A federal judge in Boston just gave the migrants at Martha's Vineyard the right to take legal action against Veritol Systems. That's the company that flew them from San Antonio to Martha's Vineyard.
This is the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
Welcome to No Border, No Country. I'm joined, as always, by Judge Matt O'Brien. Hi, Matt. How you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
So, Matt, Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts is back in the news again. Remember, was it 2 years ago now that they had some flights up there of migrants and it caused a big kerfuffle up there?
Yes, it did.
Well, it's back in the news again, and we have a report that's going to explain it, and I'd like to get your thoughts on what's really going on here.
Sure.
So let's take a look.
Morning, guys. A federal judge in Boston just gave the migrants at Martha's Vineyard the right to take legal action against Veritol Systems. That's the company that flew them from San Antonio to Martha's Vineyard.
For now, Governor DeSantis will not face legal action for his involvement in transporting dozens of migrants from Texas to Martha's Vineyard.
It is not defensible for a superpower to not have any control over the territory of its country.
In 2022, about 50 primarily Venezuelan migrants were told they were just a flight away from work and housing opportunities. For thousands of dollars per flight, partially funded by the state, the migrants got on a Veritol plane in San Antonio to take them to Massachusetts. They argue the promised opportunities were not there, and most people weren't expecting them at Martha's Vineyard.
Venezuela, it's difficult to live there. That's why not just me, but thousands of Venezuelans looked for a way out of the country, in search of a future more than anything, to be honest.
The court says they see no legitimate purpose for rounding up highly vulnerable individuals on false pretenses and publicly injecting them into a divisive national debate. The governor helped organize the migrant flights, but a Boston judge ruled the charter flight company would be at fault. The governor's office says all of their flights were conducted lawfully. They will remain out of this case unless the migrants' lawyers bring the state back into it.
Judge O'Brien, your analysis.
This is the most absurd thing I've ever heard. So first of all, I don't understand what legal basis there would be for holding liable a company that was contracted by the state of Texas to fly these people to a location where they were all told they would be taken. So, I mean, what you have here is somebody coming and saying, hey, would you like a free flight to Martha's Vineyard? And then they delivered on it. This is, anti-borders agitation groups trying to create a problem where none exists.
Isn't this kind of like, say someone rented a car, kidnapped someone, and took them away in the car, and then the family of the kidnapped person sues the rental car company? I mean, where's the liability on the company's part?
Well, I mean, I don't even like that analogy because it involves a kidnapping. This is more like people showed up at a bus station and somebody said, hey, a third party said, would you like a free Greyhound ticket to St. Louis? And people said yes. And then when they got there, for whatever reason, the press didn't want them there. And they went, oh, well, this is a bunch of NGOs that represent aliens who are anti-borders, anti-immigration enforcement, hovering around this like vultures over a rotten corpse, trying to make something out of nothing. And so they have gone to these people who have all been told that America is the destination where you get freebies and handouts, and told you've become a victim. How are these people victims? I grew up in Massachusetts. I've never been to Martha's Vineyard because it's too expensive. I've never been able to afford to go there. These people got taken there for free. And the only thing bad that happened is that the local governments in Martha's Vineyard, which are apparently all anti-immigrant racists, said, we don't want these people here, and turned them around and sent them back to mainland Massachusetts.
Yes, there's a number of angles to this story that I'd like us to dive into here. But if I recall correctly from this story, when it first came out into the news, didn't DeSantis say that they talked to each one of those people in their native language and got them to read and understand a document saying that they were fully aware where they were being taken and all of that, and they signed it. So what about that?
Well, apparently the state of Texas told all of these folks, you're going here if you take this flight. You're not obligated to take it, but if you do, this is where it's going to bring you. And for those of you who are trying to get to places like Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, possibly New York City, this is a free flight that'll get you a step closer. They gave them a waiver document that was in both English and Spanish that they all signed, as far as my understanding goes. And so I'm trying to figure out exactly what the basis for this lawsuit is. And, this just shows what a complete mockery of the legal system that activist judges make. This is Massachusetts, the People's Republic, possibly one of the most left-leaning states in the United States, aside from California. And they brought this in front of a local judge there who is, and I'm assuming this was a federal case because it involves issues of, interstate legal issues. And the federal judges in Massachusetts are every bit as liberal as the state court judges. So
now, one of the things in that video, they said that the migrants felt duped because they got there and they were told there was work, and they got there and they said there wasn't any work there. Now, from what we've all read about Martha's Vineyard, you said you've never been to it, but there's a lot of information you can gather out there. It is largely a tourist island. There are people, there's a lot of bed and breakfasts, there's inns and hotels and things like that. Couldn't these Good Samaritans up in Martha's Vineyard conjure up some jobs for the few people that made this trip? I mean, surely there's a housekeeping job or something they could have come up with to help these people.
Well, let's back up a minute. Most of these folks, if the current administration bothered to process them into the United States at all, don't have any authorization to work. So how is it even relevant that they were promised work? The other thing is neither the transportation company nor the state of Texas has any responsibility to find these people jobs. So how that figures into it, I don't know at all. But yes, Martha's Vineyard is one of the most absolutely filthy rich postal codes in the entire United States. And the fact is that the portion of the island's population that is not filthy rich are the people that provide services to the wealthy people that reside there. And there are a lot of people involved that are locals in the tourism trade. And, I've written a couple of articles about this and what a complete mockery it is. And what this comes down to is that the Ralph Lauren polo brand wearing, tennis and lawn croquet set that lives on Martha's Vineyard simply doesn't want these people there. And why is that? Well, it's because they're not like the people on Martha's Vineyard. And I'm sure they'd never say this publicly over a civilized afternoon tea in the country club, but I'm sure that they're worried about them bringing crime and other things which are not typically problems on Martha's Vineyard. So what's the solution? They dump them back onto the mainland with no care as to where they wind up. And if they happen to wind up in some blue-collar community like the one I grew up in, down on Cape Cod. I didn't grow up on Cape Cod. I grew up slightly north of there on the coast. But if these folks wind up, in the next nearest blue-collar community on Cape Cod, then so be it. They're not bothering the wealthy people that hang out on Martha's Vineyard.
So in preparation for this, I did a little research on the island and came up with some data, some very interesting data. Okay. The per capita income on the island is $93,410. That's a lot higher than the national average.
Well, and you have to take into account the typical income on the island is probably much higher than that. That average is being dragged down by the people who do things like come there seasonally to make beds and clean toilets in hotels, who may be getting paid an hourly wage or may be getting some kind of seasonal compensation package. You also take into account there are a significant number of J visa foreign nationals who come on what are characterized as exchange programs, but they do things like work as chambermaids and lifeguards in resort communities. There's a minimum level that they have to be paid at, but it's really low, and part of their pay package is the room and board that they receive. So those things all skew that down lower than it typically is for the majority of the people who are able to afford property on the island.
So this one will be a little more telling. The median home price on the island, $1.65 million. That's a little more close to the mark, wouldn't you say?
If you stop and think about that, Brian, that is probably one of the highest median home prices that you find anywhere in the United States. I think Calorama in D.C., Georgetown in D.C., Rodeo Drive in the Hollywood Hills in California, and maybe like Grosse Pointe in Michigan might be on that level or slightly higher. But if you think about that, that's $1.6 million as a median home price. That's astounding.
Yeah. And some of the famous residents there, people who own homes, the Obamas, the Clintons, Oprah Winfrey, Spike Lee, all the elites. So it's a playground for the rich.
Well, and these are all people that have consistently been advocates for open borders, amnesty for aliens, jobs for anybody, even if they're here unlawfully. Interesting, Oprah didn't step up and offer any of these folks jobs. I didn't hear her. Obama and the Clintons, who have been advocates of all kinds of lax immigration policies, didn't hear from them.
Yeah. And then also, not for nothing, but we'll say it, it's here. The island's population, 86.9% white, only 10.1% Hispanic, and 7.2% black. It sounds like they could use a little diversity there, Matt, don't you think?
Well, if they want to be inclusive and establish some equity, of course.
Where's the diversity? I mean, what's going on here?
Well, and I don't know for certain what percentage of the Hispanic population there are, wealthy summer homeowners with the $1.6 million homes. And again, that's a median, not the specific home prices, which means there's many that are much more expensive than that. How many of the Hispanics there are working in hotels or cleaning these houses? And how many of them own houses next door to the Obamas or the Clintons?
Right. Yeah, that would probably be zero.
That would be my guess.
Yeah. And then, as you recall, when this incident first came into the news, there were video clips of the residents there formed these kind of welcoming committees for these plane loads. And you had these, what could be easily described as Karens greeting them. And they had little, as you said, like little lobster rolls or whatever you described it as, T-shirts and trinkets to give them. And they were very welcoming for the cameras. But what was the reality of what happened? They were off the island within 48 hours. And when they were asked about it, they said, well, where are you going to put them? And the response was very quick, well, they can't stay here. They got to go somewhere, but we're going to find a place for them, which was conveniently away from them.
This is virtue signaling crap. We're going to have these people in and get the photo op in the basement of the local Unitarian Universalist church. We're going to give everyone a free lobster roll and donations of gently used Vineyard Vines clothing and show this big welcome. And then we're going to hustle them off the island. Yeah. Now, if you stop and think about this, if you had a community in the Midwest or somewhere else in New England or in the Deep South, and a bunch of Hispanics rolled off an airplane, the government would be suing those people in the community for violating every federal law, rule, regulation, statute, and civil rights, anything that they could find. Here, you have the rich white folks going, please get rid of the Hispanics and ship them back to mainland Massachusetts. And they're suing the transportation company, not the racists that wanted these people out of their hometown as quickly as possible. Now, of course, this also puts aside the key point to all of this is that none of these people should be here in the first place. They're foreign nationals with no right to be in the United States. None of them, and I can say this with virtual certainty, none of them have a legitimate asylum claim, and they shouldn't have been let in here in the first place. Yet the current administration in charge of the United States wants, for whatever reason, open borders with no restrictions. And so they brought all of these people in here. And when the state of Texas and the state of Florida, which are being deluged and overrun, took an action to just send these people to a resort community, somehow that gets turned into a crime. I mean, there was a sheriff in Texas that was claiming that Governors Abbott and DeSantis should be investigated for engaging in criminal acts by sending people to a tourist destination. I got half a mind to go down to the Texas border and hang around until I can get on one of these flights and have a vacation in Martha's Vineyard for the first time in my life.
You take a I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word.
A circuitous route.
Circuitous route to Martha's Vineyard. What do you think are the chances that some of these wealthy islanders also look down their nose at the residents of Texas as hateful xenophobes because they complain about the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that have passed through their community on the way to somewhere in the United States?
Well, I think there's a pretty significant possibility of that, although ironically, Houston and Dallas may have some of the areas that compete in terms of median income and median home price. So I think that's primarily a cultural thing. But it's mind-boggling to me that these are the very same people who are funding all of this DEI nonsense and critical race theory nonsense in educational institutions and forcing it into the public sphere. And when they have an opportunity to put their money where their mouth is and act like they're genuinely interested in diversity, what do? They react the same way that the people in Texas and New Mexico and California and Arizona, whose communities are being overrun, and they go, oh, we don't know if we're happy about this. At least the people on the southern border are being honest, saying these people are foreign nationals. We don't want them here. The people up in Martha's Vineyard have been saying via their votes, their political actions, and where they donate their money, we do want these people here. Then when they showed up, it was like, send them back to the plebes on the mainland because we don't want to have to deal with this. We don't want our views interrupted.
Isn't it curious that as this deluge has come in to places like New York City and Chicago, the local politicians there are very comfortable relegating them to public school gyms where lower income families tend to send their children and things like that. The second the problem rubs up against elitism, the wealth, the 1%, now it's a problem. Now immediate action is required to get them somewhere else.
Well, I don't know much about the Martha's Vineyard school system, but I went to a Catholic school in Massachusetts, and I would guess the public schools on Martha's Vineyard probably have significantly nicer facilities than the ones that I experienced at a private school. And, you know, they don't want a bunch of grubby foreign nationals messing up their school gyms.
Yes. And that's why housing them in the school gym was never going to happen.
No, it was never going to happen. They didn't even want to put them in the church basements.
Yeah. So, Matt, we just talked about some of the past on this story, but let's bring it up to the present. Tell us what is going on here legally as far as this new action that's brought this story back in the news.
So one of the county sheriffs in Texas, I believe he's the individual with responsibility for the county around San Antonio. And his name is escaping me right now, but we've done some fairly extensive coverage of this in the past. Way back when this first happened, decided that he was going to investigate this as a crime, and he certified that all of these people who were given free passage to Martha's Vineyard were victims of crimes, and sponsored them for crime victim visas, courtesy of the U.S. government, which they have now been granted. The government has 3 programs, the ST and U visas for people who have been victims of crimes, trafficking, or are serving as witnesses. The S visa is for witnesses. The U visa is for certain types of crime victims and certain trafficking victims. And the T visa applies exclusively to trafficking victims that meet a certain definition of trafficking. So the suggestion that these folks were somehow the victim of a crime is patently offensive. They committed a crime. They committed a violation of 8 U.S.C. 1326 when they crossed the U.S. border and entered the country without proper authorization. The criminal offense is called improper entry by an alien. They're in violation of a whole bunch of civil regulations that could result in their deportation. For the Department of Homeland Security to classify these people as victims of a crime when they were given a first-class flight to a tourist destination and then free onward transportation to mainland Massachusetts. It's absurd. I mean, it's a complete inversion of everything that we do in this country in terms of immigration enforcement, respect for the rule of law, and maintenance of order. And it's as an attorney and a former judge, I cannot even express how astounded I am that USCIS would grant these. But this is, we have Ali Mayorkas as the Secretary of Homeland Security, whose primary interest is in ideology, not in enforcing the Immigration and Nationality Act as it's written. So this is the kind of outcomes that you have.
Now, help me understand this, because there have been numerous reports over the last few years about how the federal government, presumably via DHS, are flying these illegal migrants all around the country, and these midnight flights under cover of darkness into these small airports to distribute these people all over the country. How is what happened in Martha's Vineyard different from what the federal government has been doing?
It isn't any different. The difference is that there is, this goes back to Rahm Emanuel's never waste a crisis. And here you had a Republican governor, DeSantis, and a Republican governor, Abbott, do something that as I guess the best way to put it would be as political theater, poked the current administration in the eye and called into question its policies. So, of course, the immediate reaction to that is to try and make it look like Abbott and DeSantis were the parties who were in the wrong here. But of course, if you stop and take a look at this, that's just absurd. It's like most average working class Americans, if somebody came to them and said, hey, would you like a free flight to Martha's Vineyard, would go, what, are you kidding me? What's the scam going on here? And if they got it, would be delightful. Here you have a bunch of foreign nationals who are proving themselves to be ungrateful, uninvited guests who were given free passage closer to places that they wanted to be, were dropped down not at LaGuardia Airport or Boston Logan Airport, neither of which are in particularly easily accessible or, welcoming areas. They're in the type of industrial sections where airports typically get placed. These people were dropped down in the airport that looks like Wings, the television series. And then were found at the airport by all the city fathers of Martha's Vineyard and given a grand welcome before they were unceremoniously tossed. So I just don't understand how this is being represented as a crime. Now, those federal flights are in complete violation of about 50 different provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act. They're probably in violation of a bunch of FAA provisions. And why is that being done? It is a deliberate demographic attack on how we apportion seats for Congress. There's a case that was decided by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which, it was decided by the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the opinion. I should be accurate about that. And it decided that illegal aliens have to be counted in the census towards the apportionment of seats for the House. And so, of course, this is a deliberate attempt to change the demographics, just the numbers of places that are either, already belong to one party or are teetering between the two of them. And it's a deliberate attempt to basically change the way the U.S. government functions in favor of people who want these types of immigration policies.
Now, whatever one may think of Abbott or DeSantis or this issue at large, you have to appreciate the pure Machiavellian genius of the idea to do what they did, in that the federal government has been perfectly comfortable using Texas as a dumping ground. They've been perfectly comfortable using a lot of other places where blue-collar, lower-income people live, and saying, what's the matter? What's the problem? You don't like people that don't look like you, and kind of shaming them like that. To take more of those migrants and put them in the backyard of the elite who favor the current administration and say, what's wrong with this? And watch them squirm and twist and try to make it make sense and position themselves as being the righteous ones. Didn't it really pull the veil back and show the phoniness of that righteousness they display all the time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect exposure of the hypocrisy, as you've pointed out. Abbott and DeSantis did exactly what the federal government has been doing to the rest of the country, and not just under this administration. There's been this kind of stuff going on for decades. I've said it repeatedly. There's both Republican and Democrat administrations that have deliberately ignored whatever parts of the Immigration and Nationality Act that they don't like in an effort to pander to perceived constituencies or to constituencies that they thought they needed to court and gain more votes from. The protection of the American borders, the public safety and the national security of the American people should not be a bargaining chip in political squabbles. And yeah, so this was, I mean, frankly, I would give both Abbott and DeSantis a handshake and a pat on the back for doing this, because they took and they did the very thing that the federal government has been doing. The federal government flipped off Florida and Texas when they complained about the federal government doing this and wasn't interested in listening to any of their complaints or their reasons for being against this. And they went and did the same thing and then just pointed to the hypocrisy that the people who support these irresponsible border control policies have whenever they're confronted with the effects of this. It's very easy to sit on Martha's Vineyard, where you're looking at a completely, wealthy, crime-free population. And, it's isolated. This is not a place where spies and foreign operatives are attempting to go. There's no national security interest at stake. It's very easy to sit there in that kind of isolated cocoon and take the kumbaya approach and laugh at the people who are trying to illustrate the practical realities that come up, the problems that you encounter with these types of irresponsible policies. It becomes a very different story when the potential threat arrives on your front lawn and you decide you don't like it. And yet these people are so dishonest that they couldn't say, nope, you know what? We don't want this. We've changed our minds. We're going to secure our border policies. They were like, oh, we love you. You're all fantastic. We love diversity in the world. Now get out.
Believe, please.
I mean, It was like a bad episode of The Simpsons.
In a similar vein, sending migrants to New York City and Chicago, to name two, also performed a valuable service in that it exposed the utter absurdity of these sanctuary mayors and how they would preen and say, immigrants are our strength. Well, more of them should make you more strong, right? But they said, and they never said, we're willing to accept X amount of migrants. They said, all are welcome. And then when they took them up on it and called their bluff, they said, whoa, that's too many. No, you can't do that. It's crazy.
Oh, well, it's, you saw this the other night. A high school acquaintance of mine named Michael Mercier runs Empower You Ohio, which is a podcast that looks at pressing social issues. And he had on activists from traditionally Black, traditionally lower income and resource-strained communities in Chicago and New York, talking about the direct effect that this has had on those places. And uniformly, the people from both Chicago and New York said, what the heck is going on here? These are people that have been in the country 2 minutes. You have people who have been citizens of the United States, some of whom are veterans, who are not being given anything, and the government's spending $500 a night to keep these people in hotels, or as they're doing in Harlem, took a publicly funded, I think it was a public-private partnership condo building, luxury condo building, and stuck all the migrants in it. And, one of the panelists said people were legitimately saying, hey, couldn't you have put the people that are living in falling apart New York City public housing into this luxury condo building because they're U.S. citizens? Some of them are veterans. All of them have contributed to the city of New York throughout the course of their lives. And maybe put the migrants into the substandard housing. It's insane. They were talking about people in their communities, older men sitting watching schools, looking like they were up to no good, people assaulting people and stealing things, people taking things from convenience stores. I mean, one of the keys to successfully managing immigration is to bring people in small enough numbers that they assimilate, that they understand what the community standards are in the United States. They understand how to behave in the public sphere and in the civic sphere, and they learn how to be Americans. That is not happening. You have a bunch of people who have been told by Marxist NGOs that America is It's like freebie Costco or Sam's Club. You come here and you don't have to pay for anything. And they've been turned loose with these attitudes into American communities. And, I grew up in a very blue-collar industrial mill town in Massachusetts near Boston that's very much like these places in New York and Chicago. And I get it. I get why they're irritated. People work very hard to get what they have. They work very hard to get and maintain homes. They work hard to educate their children. And, they don't want their kids leaving, the Catholic school that they spent a fortune to afford tuition on and being accosted by foreign adults on the way home who, have an eye towards stealing their kids' Air Jordans or their cell phone or whatever. And that's literally what's been happening in New York and Chicago.
The anger of those groups, particularly the ones in Chicago that we've seen on these reports, is so righteous because for years they've complained to their aldermen, their local representatives that there's too many drugs in our neighborhood. There's too much crime. The companies that would provide jobs are leaving because the economic conditions here are so bad. And the answer from the government was always to them, well, we're at the limits of our resources and we have budgets and we can't go. And then the second the political establishment in this country decided it's to our advantage to have untold millions of foreign nationals come in here illegally, all of a sudden these untold millions of dollars became available. Like, well, how much is Chicago spending on illegal people there now? I mean, I thought Brandon Johnson announced recently they're spending like $60 million on a new program there. I mean, those people have every right to be furious.
Well, they're spending $60 million on a new program there after they spent, I think, $48 million, and after they spent several other millions. And this is a place that cut its police budget while it's in one of the biggest homicide and violent crime crises. I mean, I was recently looking at the homicide rates, and all these people who are claiming that they're fleeing violence in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, all those places in Central and South America, the homicide rates in the major cities in most of those places are like 5-6 points lower than they are in places like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Pittsburgh. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Chicago is one of the most dangerous places in the world. The weekend homicide rate there is generally higher than the week-long homicide rate in a place like Israel. And Israel's been in a war zone for the last 50 years. I mean, it's just shocking that people in power in the United States will focus this much attention on uninvited foreign guests, and they'll do it to the detriment and to the exclusion of the interests of American citizens. It's unconscionable.
So, Matt, I think we dissected what's going on here, but going forward, using your judge's robe, what do you think's how's this gonna play out?
It's interesting, Brian. I am struggling to see what the basis for this lawsuit against a transportation company is. I think with a lot of these things at the lower level courts, you wind up getting activist judges making ideological decisions, not legal ones. I'm having trouble seeing how this is going to end with the transportation company being held liable. I'm not seeing it. So I have a sneaking suspicion that if they don't settle this out of court in order to get rid of it and make it go away, if they win at the district court level, I think they're very likely to be overturned on appeal. It's unfortunate because pursuing this kind of litigation is expensive for the defendants as well as the plaintiffs. And you hate to see something like this put a company out of business while it's trying to vindicate itself. But this is one of those things that might have to go to the Supreme Court to get any kind of a reasonable decision. But I got to tell you, after having spent 30 years involved in the practice of law, I am having trouble wrapping my head around where the basis for a case is here.
Now, didn't the anti-borders lobby also pursue similar action against the bus companies that bus people into New York?
Yeah, they've been pursuing all kinds of litigation against the bus companies. The bus companies operate on such a margin that most of them fold. Greyhound had an issue with this. There is a segment of the Immigration and Nationality Act that gives the Border Patrol basically unfettered power to search any means of conveyance, public conveyance, bus, train, tramway car. It may even extend to private taxis if it's within a certain distance of the border in order to find people who may be sneaking into the country so that they can't use public conveyances to go away. And of course, Greyhound had under the not the prior administration, but the one before that, when it had a bunch of similar issues with letting people into the country, the Border Patrol was boarding Greyhound buses all around the border zone in Arizona, New Mexico, California. And they were finding all kinds of illegal aliens. And of course, they were arresting them, taking them off the buses, detaining them, and putting them in removal proceedings, which is exactly what they're supposed to do. So a bunch of groups got together and sued Greyhound and Peter Pan and a bunch of the other bus lines, and said, oh, you have to agree to not let the Border Patrol on, which of course the bus companies can't determine when a law enforcement agency is entitled to make a lawful search or not. And then they paid up money to settle the cases. And so, you may have this happen. That unfortunately prohibited most of the bus cases from getting to a higher court where some kind of genuinely legally based decision could be made. We'll have to wait and see what actually happens with this. But it's just, I just cannot get away from the fact that 90% of the people in the United States who can't afford to go to Martha's Vineyard and know what it's all about are probably sitting listening to all this news coverage going, man, I wish somebody would give me a free ticket there. And if Martha's Vineyard doesn't work, I'm sure they take a free ticket to Nantucket or even to just, Cape Cod in general.
Congratulations, you made it to the end of the podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the Immigration Reform Law Institute, go to irli.org. If you found this information useful and you'd like to support the show, go to irli.org/podcast. You can also hear this show on Apple Podcasts, Rumble, and Spotify. And don't forget to check us out on all the major social media platforms. Thanks again.